Imagine a world where every effort ends in vain, where victory slips through your fingers like sand, and where the cleverest of men faces an eternal, merciless fate. This is the story of Sisyphus, a king who outwitted the gods, chained death itself, and tried to defy the natural order. He thought he could beat the system. He thought he could outsmart death itself. But the ancient gods had other plans. Today, we dive into a myth of human cunning, pride, and the absurdity of existence. Welcome to a world where one man and one stone define the meaning of eternity. In the ancient city of Corinth, when the world was young and the gods still took active interest in the affairs of mortals, there lived a man whose cunning was matched only by his arrogance. His name was Sisyphus, and he was the founder and king of one of Greece's most prosperous cities. A merchant prince whose sharp mind and sharper tongue had built an empire from rocky hillsides and strategic geography. Corinth occupied a crucial position on the narrow isthmus connecting the Peloponnese to mainland Greece. Anyone traveling between Athens and Sparta had to pass through Sisyphus's territory. Any merchant ship seeking to avoid the dangerous passage around the southern cape could portage their cargo across his land, for a fee, of course. Sisyphus understood that location was everything, and he exploited his city's position with ruthless efficiency. But it wasn't just his strategic sense that made Sisyphus legendary. The man was brilliant in a way that made people uncomfortable, the kind of intelligence that could see through deceptions, anticipate moves 3 steps ahead, and find loopholes in seemingly airtight agreements. He was a master manipulator, a silver-tongued negotiator who could convince you that black was white and that giving him everything you owned was actually in your best interest. His merchants spoke of him with awe and fear. His rivals spoke of him with grudging respect and barely concealed hatred. His subjects spoke of him with pride and unease, grateful for the prosperity he brought them, but always aware that their king was not quite like other men. There was something about Sisyphus that felt more trickster than ruler, more fox than lion, more dangerous than trustworthy. He was handsome in the way that clever men often are, not with the obvious beauty of heroes like Achilles or Paris, but with sharp features that reflected the quickness of his mind. His eyes were restless, always calculating, always seeking advantage. When he smiled, which was often, it rarely reached those eyes. He dressed richly but not ostentatiously, understanding that true power didn't need to shout. Sisyphus had built Corinth through his wits, transforming it from a minor settlement into a thriving commercial hub. He established trade routes, negotiated treaties, and cultivated relationships with powerful neighbors. He was a patron of the arts and a builder of temples, though whether his piety was genuine or merely political calculation, no one could quite say. Certainly, he made the proper sacrifices and observed the proper rituals, but there was always something perfunctory about it, as if he were checking items off a list rather than actually worshipping. The truth was that Sisyphus didn't really respect the gods. Oh, he feared their power. He wasn't stupid. But respect was another matter entirely. He saw them as he saw everything else: pieces on a board, forces to be managed, problems to be solved. The gods had their rules and their domains, and like any rules, they had loopholes. Like any system, they could be gamed. This attitude would prove to be his undoing. But in those early days, when Corinth was rising, and Sisyphus was at the height of his power, such concerns seemed distant. He was clever enough to outwit any mortal, wealthy enough to buy his way out of most problems, and confident enough to believe he could talk his way out of the rest. He had a wife, Merope, one of the Pleiades, a nymph of notable beauty and questionable judgment in marrying a mortal so obviously ambitious and amoral. They had children together, including a son named Glaucus, who would have his own tragic story. But Sisyphus's true love was never his family. It was the game itself, the endless chess match of accumulating power, outwitting rivals, and proving himself the smartest person in any room. His subjects prospered under his rule, it must be said. Corinth grew wealthy, its position exploited to maximum effect. Trade flowed through the city like water, and a percentage of everything stuck to Sisyphus's fingers. He built walls and temples, established laws and customs, and created the infrastructure of a great city. He was, by most measures, a successful king. But success breeds confidence, and confidence breeds carelessness. Sisyphus was about to discover that there were some forces in the world that couldn't be outmaneuvered with cleverness alone. He was about to learn that while he might be the cleverest mortal alive, there were immortals who didn't appreciate being treated like pieces in a game. And the first of these was Zeus himself, king of the gods, whose attention Sisyphus was about to attract in the worst possible way. The trouble began as so many troubles in Greek mythology do, with Zeus's wandering eye and complete lack of discretion. The king of the gods had spotted a beautiful river nymph named Aegina, daughter of the river god Asopus, and decided he must have her. The fact that she was unwilling, that her father would object, that abducting her would cause immense suffering. None of these considerations gave Zeus pause. He wanted her, and gods took what they wanted. So Zeus, in one of his many transformations designed to facilitate his affairs, swept Aegina away to an island. He changed himself into an eagle or a flame or something else suitably dramatic. The stories vary on the specifics, and carried her off, leaving her father distraught and searching desperately for his missing daughter. Asopus searched everywhere, questioning everyone, using all his power as a river god to seek information about where his daughter had gone. He was frantic with worry and rage, and the entire region felt his distress as his waters swelled and flooded, reflecting his emotional turbulence. Now, here's where Sisyphus enters the picture. From his vantage point in Corinth, perched on his citadel with its commanding view of the surrounding landscape, Sisyphus had witnessed the abduction. His sharp eyes had caught sight of the eagle or the flame, or whatever form Zeus had taken. There was only one problem. Sisyphus had just betrayed Zeus. Word traveled fast when gods were involved. Asopus, armed with the knowledge of his daughter's kidnapper, confronted Zeus, or at least attempted to, which took more courage than most mortals possessed. The attempt was futile, of course. Zeus struck him down with a thunderbolt, sending the river god limping back to his waters, wounded and defeated, but at least having tried to defend his daughter's honor. But Zeus was not content with merely defeating Asopus. He wanted to know who had revealed his secret. The answer came quickly. Sisyphus, king of Corinth, had traded divine secrets for a water spring. The mortal had witnessed a god's private affair and then sold that information for personal gain. Zeus was furious. The king of the gods was used to mortals either worshipping him or fearing him, not treating him as a commodity to be bartered. He had gotten away with countless abductions and affairs because mortals knew better than to interfere. And now this upstart king, this clever merchant, had dared to expose him and profit from it. Punishment was inevitable, but Zeus had a principle. He rarely handled the direct punishment of individual mortals himself. It was beneath his station, and besides, he had people for that. Specifically, he had Thanatos, death personified, who handled the collection of mortal souls when their time came. Zeus decided that Sisyphus's time had come. He ordered Thanatos to go to Corinth and collect the king's soul, to bring him down to the underworld where he belonged. It was a straightforward assignment, one that Thanatos had performed countless times before. A mortal had angered the gods, and now that mortal would die. Simple, clean, efficient. But Zeus had made a crucial error. He had underestimated Sisyphus. The king of Corinth hadn't survived and thrived by being simple or straightforward. He hadn't built an empire by accepting the inevitable. And he certainly wasn't going to go quietly into death just because Zeus said it was time. Sisyphus had one great advantage. He was clever enough to be dangerous, but not so powerful that he couldn't be underestimated. Thanatos was about to learn this lesson the hard way. Thanatos arrived in Corinth as he had arrived in countless other places, as an inexorable force, an inevitable conclusion, the final punctuation mark on every mortal story. He appeared to Sisyphus in his palace, his presence causing the torches to dim and the air to grow cold. He was not cruel or malicious, Thanatos. He was simply function, the mechanism by which all mortal lives ended. He had come to collect Sisyphus, and collect him he would. But Sisyphus had been expecting him. The king of Corinth was many things, but unprepared was not one of them. From the moment he had betrayed Zeus, he had known retaliation would come, and Sisyphus had a plan. He greeted Thanatos with courtesy and curiosity rather than fear. "So, your death," he said, studying the figure before him with the frank assessment of someone examining a piece of interesting merchandise. "I've heard so much about you. Tell me, is it true what they say, that you carry souls to the underworld in special chains?" It was a simple question, asked with genuine seeming interest. And Thanatos, who was a personification rather than a person, who operated on function rather than personality, saw no reason not to answer. Yes, he showed Sisyphus. These were the chains. They were unbreakable, mystical bindings that secured souls for their journey to the realm of Hades. No one could escape them once bound. "Fascinating," Sisyphus said, moving closer to examine the chains. "But surely they can't be that secure. I mean, they're just chains, aren't they? I've never seen any chains that couldn't be broken or escaped from if you were clever enough." This was, of course, exactly the kind of challenge that shouldn't have worked. Thanatos was death. He wasn't supposed to have an ego to prick or pride to wound. But there's a reason personifications take human form, a reason they interact with mortals as if they were people rather than forces. In taking form, they take on aspects of personality, and Sisyphus had found the thread to pull. "These chains cannot be broken," Thanatos said, with the absolute certainty of one who had never been proven wrong. "No mortal has ever escaped them." "Prove it," Sisyphus said simply. "Show me. Put them on yourself, and show me how they work. Because I think If I'm going to spend eternity bound in these things, I deserve to understand them first. It was audacious, ridiculous, the kind of request that should have been dismissed out of hand. But Sisyphus had a gift for making the absurd seem reasonable, for framing his manipulations as simple, logical requests. And Thanatos, confident in his chains and his function, saw no harm in demonstrating their mechanism. He put on the chains. The moment they clicked shut, Sisyphus struck. Not with a weapon. You couldn't kill death, but with more chains, locks, and bindings. He had prepared a cell in the deepest part of his palace, a room designed specifically to hold something immortal, and into this room he dragged the bound death, securing him with every lock and bar and seal he had prepared. Thanatos realized too late what had happened. He had been tricked, trapped by a mortal through sheer cunning and audacity. He raged against his bonds, but even death himself could not break the chains he had been bound in. The room Sisyphus had prepared was hidden and secure, and no one would find Thanatos there unless Sisyphus wanted him found, and Sisyphus very much did not want him found. With Thanatos imprisoned, something remarkable happened. People stopped dying. Old men on their deathbeds lingered indefinitely, neither improving nor expiring. Warriors took mortal wounds in battle and continued fighting, unable to die no matter how grievous their injuries. The natural order of mortality ceased to function because its mechanism, death himself, was locked in a cell beneath Sisyphus's palace. At first, people rejoiced. No more death, no more funerals, no more grief, no more losing loved ones. It seemed like a miracle, a gift from the gods. But as days turned to weeks, the reality of a deathless world began to reveal itself. The elderly who had been ready to die, who had lived full lives and were ready to rest, found themselves trapped in failing bodies that could not release them. Warriors with terrible wounds that should have killed them instantly were stuck in eternal agony. The natural cycle of life was broken, and without death, life itself began to lose meaning. But Sisyphus didn't care. He had cheated death, literally, and that was all that mattered. He had outwitted Zeus, trapped Thanatos, and proved himself cleverer than gods and death itself. He walked through his city with a smile, knowing that he had done the impossible. He had won, or so he thought. The absence of death was noticed quickly in certain quarters. Mortals might have been slow to realize the full implications, but the gods understood immediately that something was terribly wrong, and none felt the disruption more keenly than Ares, the god of war. Ares loved war, not in the strategic, honorable way that Athena loved it, but in its raw, brutal reality. He loved the clash of weapons, the smell of blood, the chaos of the battlefield. He was the embodiment of warfare's violence and its glory. And war without death, that was pointless, meaningless, a game without stakes. Imagine a battlefield where soldiers could be wounded but not killed, where they fought on despite injuries that should have been fatal, where the conflict could never truly be resolved because neither side could actually lose. It was a mockery of everything Ares represented. The god of war was being denied his very purpose. Ares investigated and quickly discovered the source of the problem. Sisyphus had somehow imprisoned Thanatos. The mortal king of Corinth, in his infinite arrogance, had broken the fundamental order of the cosmos. Death itself was chained in a cell, and the world was suffering for it. Ares descended on Corinth in a fury. He was not subtle or clever like Hermes, not measured like Apollo. He was violence personified, and he brought that violence directly to Sisyphus's doorstep. The palace guards who tried to stop him were tossed aside like children's toys. The walls that were supposed to protect the king might as well have been made of paper. Ares found Sisyphus in his throne room, still smiling that insufferable smile, still confident in his cleverness. "Where is Thanatos?" the god demanded, his voice like thunder, his presence radiating barely controlled rage. Sisyphus, to his credit, didn't crumble immediately. He tried to negotiate, tried to use his silver tongue to talk his way out of the situation. He explained that he had simply been defending himself, that Zeus had unfairly targeted him for death, that surely the god of war could understand a man fighting for his survival. But Ares was not Zeus. He was not interested in clever words or philosophical debates about justice. He was interested in restoring death to the world so that war could mean something again. He grabbed Sisyphus by the throat and lifted him off the ground. Where is Thanatos? Faced with immediate physical violence from a god who could literally tear him apart, Sisyphus's cleverness finally found its limit. He revealed the location of the hidden cell, led Ares to it, watched as the god of war tore away the locks and bindings and freed death from his imprisonment. Thanatos emerged furious and humiliated. He had been bound by a mortal, trapped through trickery, made a fool of. The natural order had been disrupted because he had been careless enough to be deceived. And now, finally free, he had a job to complete. The job he should have completed weeks ago. He turned to Sisyphus with cold finality. "Your time is up, King of Corinth. You've delayed the inevitable, but you cannot escape it. You will come with me now, and no tricks will save you, this time." And indeed, no tricks would. Ares stood there, ensuring compliance, his hand on his sword, his patience utterly exhausted. Thanatos was doubly careful now, taking no chances, accepting no requests, entertaining no delays. He bound Sisyphus in chains that actually held this time, and together they began the journey to the underworld. Sisyphus went, but he was already thinking. His first plan had ultimately failed, but he had learned from it. He knew now that he couldn't simply avoid death indefinitely, but perhaps he could find a different loophole, a different angle. He was being taken to the underworld, but that didn't mean he had to stay there. His clever mind was already working on the next scheme, the next trick, the next impossibility he would attempt, because that was who Sisyphus was, a man who simply could not accept that some things were beyond manipulation, that some forces could not be deceived, that some inevitabilities actually were inevitable. He had cheated death once. He would cheat again, and this time he thought he would do it better. The journey to the underworld was one way for most mortals. You descended into the shadowy realm of Hades, crossed the river Styx, passed through the gates guarded by the three-headed hound Cerberus, and became one of the countless shades wandering the asphodel meadows for eternity. It was final, irrevocable, the ultimate destination from which there was no return. But Sisyphus had no intention of accepting this fate quietly. Even as Thanatos led him down into the depths, even as the light of the living world faded behind them, Sisyphus was plotting. The key to his next scheme, however, required preparation. Preparation he had made before being taken. Before his arrest by Thanatos, Sisyphus had given his wife Merope very specific instructions. When he died, she was to do absolutely nothing. No funeral rites, no burial, no proper ceremonies. His body was to be left exactly as it was, unburied, unwashed, without the proper coins placed on his eyes to pay Charon the ferryman, without any of the rituals that ensured a smooth transition to the afterlife. Merope, whether out of love or fear or simply resignation to her husband's schemes, did exactly as instructed. When word came that Sisyphus had been taken to the underworld, she made no preparations for his funeral. She held no ceremonies, made no offerings to the gods of death, performed none of the rites that widows were expected to perform. She simply went about her daily business as if nothing had happened, as if her husband was still alive and would return at any moment. In the underworld, Sisyphus's shade stood before Hades and Persephone, the king and queen of the dead. This was the judgment, the moment when his life would be assessed and his eternal fate determined. Given his crimes, betraying Zeus, imprisoning Death, disrupting the natural order, he should have been sent directly to Tartarus, the deepest pit of torment reserved for the worst offenders. But Sisyphus had one card left to play. He approached the throne with appropriate humility, a performance of contrition that he had practiced many times in his political career. He spoke of his regrets, his understanding that he had overstepped, his acceptance of divine judgment. And then, almost as an aside, he mentioned something troubling. His wife had not performed the proper funeral rites. His body lay unburied, his spirit unanchored, the ceremonies unobserved. "My lord and lady," he said, addressing Hades and Persephone with careful respect, "I understand that I have earned my place here, and I accept your judgment, but I am troubled by something that reflects poorly not on me, but on my wife. She has failed to perform the most basic duties of a widow. My body lies unburied, exposed to the elements, denied the proper rites. This is not merely a personal insult. It is an affront to the sacred traditions, to the proper order of things." He let this sink in, watched the royal couple consider his words. Then he played his final card. "I ask permission to return to the living world, temporarily, of course, to instruct my wife in her duties, to ensure that my body receives proper burial, that the rituals are performed correctly, that the gods of death receive their proper honors. It is a matter of maintaining proper respect for these traditions. Surely such a brief exception for such a proper purpose would be acceptable." It was brilliant in its manipulation. Sisyphus was appealing not to mercy or forgiveness, but to the gods' own vanity and their concern for proper ritual observance. He was framing his escape attempt as actually being about respecting the proper order, the very order he had so flagrantly violated. And he was targeting Persephone in particular, who, as queen of the underworld, had a vested interest in ensuring that the proper death rites were observed. Hades was skeptical. He was the lord of the dead, ancient and wise, and he had seen countless souls try countless tricks to escape his realm. But Persephone was moved by the argument. It was true that proper burial rites were important, that the failure to observe them was troubling, and Sisyphus was only asking for a temporary return, just long enough to instruct his wife and ensure proper compliance with tradition. The king and queen of the dead consulted quietly. Finally, incredibly, they agreed. Sisyphus would be allowed to return to the living world temporarily to ensure his proper burial. He was to instruct his wife, oversee the ceremonies, and then return immediately to the underworld to face his judgment. Sisyphus agreed to these terms with solemn sincerity, concealing the triumph that surged through him. He had done it. He had talked his way out of death itself, convinced the rulers of the underworld to let him go. He was about to return to life through nothing but clever words and audacious lies. Thanatos led him back up the path to the living world, surely suspicious but bound by the decision of his king and queen. They emerged into sunlight, into the world of the living, and Sisyphus felt his mortality returning, felt breath fill his lungs and warmth touch his skin. He was alive again. He had cheated death not once but twice, and he had absolutely no intention of going back. Once back in the land of the living, Sisyphus did exactly what everyone should have known he would do. Nothing that he had promised. He did not instruct his wife to perform his funeral rites. He did not oversee proper ceremonies. He did not prepare to return to the underworld. Instead, he simply resumed his life as if nothing had happened, as if he had never died at all, as if he hadn't just perpetrated the most audacious con in the history of the cosmos. Maribel welcomed him back with relief and exasperation in equal measure. She had known, of course, that his instructions to skip the funeral rites were part of some scheme. That was simply who Sisyphus was. Always plotting, always angling, always convinced he could outsmart anyone and everyone. But even she was impressed that it had actually worked, that he had somehow convinced the gods of death themselves to let him return. "How long do you think they'll let you stay?" she asked him on his first night back. Sisyphus smiled that insufferable smile. "Long enough," he said, and then, with absolute confidence, "Forever, if I'm clever about it." And for a while, it seemed like he might actually be right. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months, months to years. Sisyphus ruled Corinth, conducted business, made treaties, and accumulated wealth. He lived openly, not even bothering to hide. It was as if he were daring the gods to come for him again, confident that if they did, he would simply talk his way out of it as he had before. The gods, for their part, were slow to respond. Partly this was divine pride. They couldn't quite believe that a mortal would be so brazen as to simply ignore his agreement and keep living. Partly it was the bureaucracy of the divine. Who exactly was responsible for enforcing the deal? Zeus was angry, but considered it beneath him. Hades and Persephone felt betrayed, but were reluctant to admit they had been fooled. Thanatos was embarrassed at having been tricked twice by the same mortal. So Sisyphus lived on year after year, growing older but still vital, still sharp, still convinced of his own invincibility. He became legendary for his cleverness, but also for his arrogance. Stories spread throughout Greece. Sisyphus had imprisoned death. Sisyphus had tricked Hades. Sisyphus had escaped the underworld itself. He became the man who had beaten the system, who had proven that even divine law had loopholes if you were clever enough to find them. But hubris, in Greek tradition, always comes with a price, and Sisyphus's bill was accumulating interest. He lived far longer than any mortal should. His lifespan extended by his escape from death's proper order. He saw his children grow old, saw his grandchildren born, saw changes in the world that few mortals ever witnessed. And perhaps in those later years, there were moments when he wondered if he had been too clever for his own good, if living beyond his natural span was really the victory he had thought it would be. But if he had such doubts, he never voiced them. Sisyphus remained defiant to the end, convinced that his intelligence made him superior to anyone and everyone, that rules were for lesser beings, that he alone had figured out how to beat the game. Finally, inevitably, age caught up with him. Not death. He had cheated death, but age. His body grew frail, his mind remained sharp, but his body betrayed him. He could no longer walk without assistance, could barely lift his arms, could feel his vitality draining away despite his previous escape from mortality's grip. He had extended his life far beyond its natural length, but he could not stop the physical decay that came with extreme age. When the end finally came, when his body simply could no longer sustain life, no matter how clever his mind remained, Thanatos was there waiting. There was no conversation this time, no opportunity for tricks. Death had learned his lesson. The moment Sisyphus's spirit separated from his body, Thanatos was there to claim it, and this time there would be no escape, no clever words, no schemes. Sisyphus's shade was dragged back to the underworld, and this time he was brought directly before the judges of the dead. Not Hades and Persephone, who he had already fooled once, but the three great judges, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus, who weighed the deeds of mortal lives and determined their eternal fates. They reviewed his life, the betrayal of Zeus, the imprisonment of Thanatos, the escape from the underworld, the years of defiance. The list of crimes was extensive, and the verdict was unanimous. Sisyphus had not simply broken rules. He had assaulted the very foundations of cosmic order. He had treated the gods with contempt, death as an obstacle to be circumvented, and divine law as a game to be beaten. He would be punished. Not with simple torment in Tartarus, though he deserved that. No, Sisyphus's punishment would be more specific, more pointed, more perfectly designed to address his particular crimes and character. The judges pronounced his sentence, and Sisyphus was led away to begin his eternal task, a punishment that would become one of the most famous in all of mythology, a symbol of futility and absurdity that would echo through the millennia and inspire philosophers and artists thousands of years into the future. The boulder was massive, larger than a man, hewn from the mountain itself. It sat at the bottom of a steep hill in Tartarus, the deepest and darkest part of the underworld, where the worst offenders spent eternity. And next to it stood Sisyphus, or rather his shade, bound now to this place and this task forever. The punishment was simple in its conception, terrible in its execution, and profound in its symbolism. Sisyphus was to push the boulder to the top of the hill. That was all. Just move this rock from the bottom to the top. And if he succeeded, well, then he could rest. His punishment would be complete. But the boulder was cursed, or enchanted, or simply obeyed the laws of this particular corner of Tartarus. Every time Sisyphus pushed it nearly to the summit, every time he was steps away from success, the boulder would slip from his grasp. It would roll back down to the bottom, undoing all his work, forcing him to start over from the beginning, again and again and again, forever. The first time Sisyphus approached the boulder, he was still Sisyphus, clever, confident, certain he could find an angle. Surely this was just another problem to be solved, another system to be gamed. He examined the boulder carefully, looking for weak points, testing different approaches. He planned his route up the hill, looking for the path that would give him the best advantage. And then he pushed. His shade, being a spirit, didn't tire in the normal sense, but it could still feel effort, could still experience the strain of moving the enormous weight. He heaved against the stone, muscles that were no longer physical straining nonetheless. Every ounce of determination focused on moving the boulder up the hill. Inch by inch, foot by foot, he progressed. The stone was heavy beyond belief. The hill steep and treacherous. Smaller rocks shifted under his feet, threatening to send him tumbling. But Sisyphus pressed on, drawing on all his reserves of stubbornness and will. He had talked his way out of death itself. He could certainly move a rock up a hill. He reached the halfway point, then 3/4. The summit was in sight now, so close he could almost touch it. Just a few more feet, just a little more effort. He could see the top of the hill, could imagine the moment of triumph when the boulder finally crested the peak. And then, with victory seeming certain, the boulder slipped. Maybe his grip faltered. Maybe the ground gave way beneath him. Maybe it was simply the nature of the curse. But suddenly the massive stone was moving backward, sliding out of his control, picking up momentum as it rolled back down the hill he had just climbed. Sisyphus watched it go tumbling and bouncing until it came to rest at the bottom once more. All his work, all his effort, undone in seconds. And he was expected to do it again. The second time, he tried a different approach. Maybe the path was the problem. He would take a different route, find better footing, be more careful near the top. He pushed the boulder up the hill again, straining and heaving, making steady progress. Again, he reached the summit. Again, at the last possible moment, the boulder rolled back down. The third time, he tried to trick the system. He looked for loopholes in the curse, tested whether the boulder could be wedged or secured, searched for any way to beat the mechanism of his punishment. But there was no trick, no clever solution, no way to game this particular system. The punishment was straightforward. Push the boulder up, watch it roll down, repeat forever. After dozens of attempts, Sisyphus began to understand the full horror of his situation. This wasn't a puzzle to be solved, or a system to be outsmarted. This was simply what it was: endless, meaningless labor with no possibility of success, no hope of completion, no end in sight. After hundreds of attempts, he stopped trying to find tricks and simply pushed. What else could he do? Refusing to push meant spending eternity at the bottom of the hill, and that seemed even worse somehow. At least pushing gave him something to do, a purpose, however pointless. After thousands of attempts, the task became automatic. He no longer thought about strategy or approached each attempt with hope. He simply pushed, climbed, reached the top, watched the boulder roll down, and started again. It was his existence now, the totality of his eternity. And there, in Tartarus, Sisyphus pushes still. If you could visit that dark corner of the underworld, you would see him, a shade, barely more than a shadow, struggling eternally with his boulder. Up the hill he goes, straining and pushing, getting so close to the top. And then, always, the stone rolls back down, and he descends to begin again. The punishment was perfect in its way. Sisyphus had spent his life believing he could outsmart any system, beat any rules, achieve the impossible through cleverness alone. He had disrupted the natural order, treated death as a problem to be solved rather than an inevitability to be accepted, and shown contempt for the cosmic laws that governed existence. Now he was trapped in a task that could not be outsmarted, in a system with no loopholes, facing an impossibility that no amount of cleverness could overcome. Every time he pushed that boulder up the hill, he was confronting the futility of his own hubris. Every time it rolled back down, he was learning the lesson he had refused to learn in life, that some things cannot be manipulated, that some forces are truly beyond human control, that acceptance is sometimes wiser than defiance. The other shades in Tartarus suffered various torments, Tantalus with his eternal hunger and thirst, Ixion bound to his burning wheel, the Danaïdes pouring water into bottomless vessels. But Sisyphus's punishment was unique in its psychological dimension. It wasn't simply torture. It was a mirror held up to his entire philosophy of life, reflecting back the ultimate futility of his clever schemes and prideful ambitions. Thousands of years after Sisyphus first began his eternal task, a French philosopher named Albert Camus would write an essay called The Myth of Sisyphus, in which he would argue something unexpected, that we must imagine Sisyphus happy. Camus saw in Sisyphus's endless, meaningless task a metaphor for human existence itself. We all push our boulders up our hills. We work jobs that seem pointless. We pursue goals that ultimately lead nowhere. We strive and struggle in a universe that offers no ultimate meaning or purpose. Life is absurd, Camus argued, and Sisyphus's punishment is simply a crystallized, concentrated version of the absurdity we all face. But Camus suggested that Sisyphus's punishment could also be seen as a kind of triumph. In that moment, when he walks back down the hill to retrieve his boulder, that brief respite when the stone is rolling away from him and his task is momentarily suspended, Sisyphus is conscious. He is aware of his situation, aware of the futility, aware of the eternal repetition. And in that awareness, Camus argued, Sisyphus becomes superior to his fate. He may be forced to push the boulder, but he understands what he is doing. His punishment cannot touch his consciousness, his ability to think and judge and be. The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. Camus wrote, one must imagine Sisyphus happy. It's a generous reading, perhaps more generous than the original myth intended, but it speaks to something profound about how we interpret ancient stories and what they mean to us across the centuries. Sisyphus, the man who tried to cheat death and defied the gods, has become a symbol not just of punishment, but of persistence, not just of futility, but of the human capacity to endure. In the original telling, Sisyphus was a villain, arrogant, amoral, treating others as pieces in his game, and the gods themselves as obstacles to be overcome. His cleverness was deployed without wisdom, his intelligence without morality. He betrayed Zeus for a water fountain, imprisoned death because he could, escaped the underworld through lies, and showed contempt for every law and custom that might have constrained him. His punishment was meant to be eternal torment, a cautionary tale about the dangers of hubris and the futility of challenging divine authority. The ancient Greeks who told this story would have seen Sisyphus's fate as entirely deserved. This is what happens when mortals forget their place, when they treat the cosmic order as something to be manipulated rather than respected. But modern interpretations have found different meanings in the myth. Some see Sisyphus as a rebel against unjust authority, a trickster figure who dared to challenge the arbitrary power of the gods. Others see him as an existential hero, confronting absurdity with continued effort despite knowing that effort is meaningless. Still others see him as a tragic figure, punished excessively for crimes that were really just attempts to survive in a world where the gods held all the power. The truth, as always, is complicated. Sisyphus was clever, but not wise, intelligent, but not moral, persistent, but not admirable. He achieved amazing things through his cunning, built a great city, tricked death itself, escaped the underworld. But he did these things without regard for anyone but himself. His victories came at others' expense. His schemes disrupted the natural order, and his arrogance knew no bounds. And yet there is something compelling about him, something that has kept his story alive for millennia. Perhaps it's his sheer audacity, his refusal to accept limits, his determination to beat the system no matter the odds. Perhaps it's the fact that, for a time, he actually succeeded. He really did chain death, really did talk his way out of the underworld, really did live beyond his appointed span. His ultimate failure doesn't erase those temporary victories. Or perhaps it's simply that we recognize something of ourselves in Sisyphus. Who among us hasn't tried to game a system, to find a loophole, to outsmart the rules? Who hasn't felt that maybe, just maybe, we're clever enough to beat the odds, to achieve the impossible, to be the exception to the rule? Sisyphus took this impulse to its extreme, but the impulse itself is profoundly human. In Tartarus, Sisyphus continues his eternal task. The boulder rolls up, the boulder rolls down. He descends, he pushes, he climbs, he fails, he starts again. It has been this way for thousands of years, and it will continue this way forever, or at least for as long as the underworld exists, as long as punishment has meaning, as long as stories are told about the price of defying death. Some nights, in certain tellings, you can hear the sound of the boulder echoing up from the depths, the scrape of stone on stone, the grunt of effort, the rumble of the rock rolling back down. It is the sound of eternal punishment, of hubris meeting its match, of cleverness discovering its limits. But it is also, perhaps, the sound of persistence, of getting up after falling down, of trying again after failure, of continuing to push even when you know the task is impossible. Sisyphus was never a hero in the traditional sense. He was a schemer, a manipulator, a man whose cleverness exceeded his wisdom. But in his eternal punishment, he has become something more than what he was in life. He has become a symbol, an idea, a question posed to everyone who hears his story. What would you do with an impossible task? Would you refuse to try? Would you give up after the first failure? Or would you, like Sisyphus, push the boulder up the hill again and again, finding meaning in the effort itself, even knowing that success is impossible? The myth of Sisyphus is ultimately about the fundamental human condition. We strive, we fail, we start over. We push our boulders up our hills knowing they'll roll back down. We pursue goals that may be meaningless in the grand scheme of things. We live in an absurd universe that offers no guarantees, no ultimate justice, no certainty that our efforts matter. And yet we push, we continue, we persist. Perhaps that's why Sisyphus' story has survived for thousands of years and will likely survive for thousands more. Not because he was admirable, he wasn't. Not because his punishment was just, that's debatable. But because in his endless, futile task, we see a reflection of our own lives, our own struggles, our own absurd determination to keep going, even when logic suggests we should stop. The man who tried to cheat death has become immortal after all, not in the way he intended, but in the only way that really matters. His story lives on, retold and reinterpreted, finding new meanings in each generation. In the darkness of Tartarus, Sisyphus pushes his boulder. Up the hill it goes, only to roll back down, and he descends once more to begin again, as he always has, as he always will, forever caught in the moment between effort and futility, between persistence and defeat, between the absurdity of existence and the human refusal to surrender to it. The boulder rolls, Sisyphus pushes, the cycle continues, and somewhere, perhaps, if you listen carefully enough, you might hear the sound of defiance, or persistence, or madness, or wisdom, echoing up from the depths of the underworld, reminding us that even in eternal punishment, even in ultimate futility, the human spirit finds a way to endure.